a shorter term thing, but then we got bonds. Bonds are 20 to 30 years. That's a long time. 20 to 30 years, man, my goodness, that's a long time to borrow money. And so essentially what this means is we've got time to kill. With 20 to 30 years, our economy can keep going. We've got the money from other countries, from other investors, and we've got time, we've got money now that, okay, we'll pay this off later, we're leveraging now, we're putting this off till later, and guess what, we can chill for now. We got time to kill. We got work to do, and we can use this money right now. And so we can use the money now for what we're doing. And with the news article that I had up earlier, there's a Miguel Faria y Castro. He basically says this simply as an economist. He says, hey, it's just about passing it on to your kids. It's like, okay, it's an interesting thought, passing it just on my kids, not dealing with it now. Well, that's really what it is we've got time to kill. And so basically what we get to tell our kids too is we're not like everybody else. We're different. We're not like everybody else. We don't have the same problems as everybody else. If you look at the United States, we have a much different GDP than everybody else does. It's easy to get lost in comparison. You got big government organizations like the UN, and you want to be able to compare and say, oh, well, here's so-and-so over here, they're doing good, and well, here we are maybe not doing such as good. Well, we get to talk about it a little more. GDP is made up of what? Well, we got government spending, consumer spending, investments from businesses, the difference between imports and exports. That's a lot I just said. But basically what it means is all the money that a country makes in 1 year domestically is your GDP. That's the net money that you're getting in out of that. So with our GDP, ours is made up of different. Each country has got different government spending. Some countries may spend more than us, some may spend less than us, and it's all relative to the size of the country. And so if we're going to compare apples to apples, let's look at the EU. They came up with a treaty called the Maastricht Treaty. It's really hard to say. Maastricht Treaty. Essentially what they're saying is, as a country, a healthy GDP ratio would be 60%. So of debt to the amount of money that we're making, 60%. Okay, that's cool. You want to know what the United States was? As of right now, probably at 4 o'clock this afternoon, 125%. That's a huge difference than compared to what the EU would want us to do. But with all due respect to the EU, we're not the same. And we have different problems, but we also have different resources. And we have a different way of doing things than they do. And so, as we're going about this, we have to see that we're not like everybody else. We're unique. There are developed nations in Europe, like Germany or France, but they're not like us. We've got different goals than the EU. The EU wants to be all concerned about price stability and worrying about inflation. That's cool. We worry about that too, but our Federal Reserve also operates on the fact of, hey, let's protect jobs. Let's look at unemployment too. We're gonna bother with this as well. And in our economy, we are very diverse. We're very diverse. We're not really into this whole like, hey, let's do a one-lane thing, a one niche, and let's just stick with it. No. You know your own economy, that it's very different. You've got all sorts of opportunities available to you. We've got technology, manufacturing, agriculture, energy. All sorts of different things are involved in our GDP, how we make our money. And the other part of it is too, is we have different problems than everybody else. We have a different way of making money than everybody else, but we also have a different set of problems. You look at 2008 with the housing market and the crash that happened there. Not everybody else was issuing mortgages like we were then. During COVID, whenever things got bad and we started issuing stimulus checks to help bring the economy back up, not other countries did like we did. And they also didn't respond the same way that we did. They didn't have the returns right back off the ground like we did right afterwards. And so, we're a little bit different than everybody else. That's why it's something to look at about our reliance on credit and the national debt. But the other part of this too is, respectfully, we ball. Like, we keep winning. The GDP keeps going up over time and we keep getting returns. Within the past decade, yes, we hit that scary ratio of when the EU said 60%, but we're sitting over here at 120. Approximately 2011, 2013, that's when we passed up 100%, which is like, okay, for all the money I owe and all the money I have, we're even. That's 100%. But then we start getting, okay, now we're going 125, and here we are now. It's like, okay, that's a little scary. But the truth of the matter is, our bonds keep getting sold. People keep buying our bonds. People keep investing in our economy. Japan right now owns nearly $1.1 trillion worth of bonds today. China owns $750 billion today worth of our bonds. Countries still look at us and they still say, the United States is a worthy investment. I think you want me to send my money over there. I like it. And guess what? They keep doing it and we'll take it. The real scary thing about this is if our GDP was to remain the same. Okay, so like here's our ratio and things are changing and we're here right now. What would be really bad if our GDP never went up again and it just stayed here and then our debt just kept going up. It's like, okay, well, we're cooked. That's not a good place to be. And so we can rejoice because that's not happening. We keep producing money, we keep producing goods and services and engaging in trade, and our country still keeps doing good. So we don't got to be worried about, okay, well, our debt's rising a ton, but our GDP is staying the same. No, that's not happening. We're still making money. We're in a good spot. We're chilling. And so what I'd like to do now is we can talk a little bit more about this from a little bit of a scriptural standpoint. The parable of the rich fool, Jesus describes in Luke 12 of, okay, a guy's got money. He wants to make more money. He wants to secure his money. He wants to be safe with his money, and he's going to build more barns. Okay, he's going to lock down everything tight, make sure he keeps and protects everything he has. But then God says, "You fool, your soul is required of you tonight." And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? How does that apply to us right now? Essentially, what the matter is too is we got to understand that we're responsible for what's going on around us, and that whenever things are going bad in our country, whenever things are happening, we do have a responsibility to take care of it. And we can't just say, okay, I'm going to lock down, hold everything tight, or I'm going to be even more greedy and take and take and take. No. We need to understand that there's something bigger at play here. And times have gotten rough. We've lived through 2008, we've lived through 2020. Times have been bad. But yet we're still here. And despite things that have happened with our national debt, the 126% that we're at now, we're still here. Life is good. Can we do something to solve this national debt? We can do as much as we can. We can try to bring this number down because it's scary. That $35.3 trillion is a big number. I don't have that. We don't each have $104,000 in our bank account to solve this. But there's hope. That God is in control and that He keeps protecting us and providing for us and everything is going to be okay. There's a lot of factors in this. One we just already mentioned is that God is in control of this, but also when we look at GDP, when we look at the economy, you've got history. When you look at history, there's historical elements of, okay, the way we dealt with mortgages in 2008, and then the way that we dealt with interest rates during 2020. Okay, there's that. There's also psychological parts of it too. Like, okay, I better hurry real quick. I'm losing my money. I need to sell all my stocks now before I lose everything during 2008 or during 2020, or even all the way back to the Great Depression. And so there's multiple elements into this part of not just economics, but there's psychology and history, and it's all wound up just into this one beautiful little present. And so what we can look at here is there's lots of elements to it, but at the very end of the day, we don't want to be a rich fool. And be greedy and say, okay, well, I'm in control of all this, and yes, and that, and I'm doing this all on my own. It's like, no. At the end of the day, God is still in control, and God is still good. And so right now, we are in uncharted waters. I mentioned 2008, I mentioned 2020, that's cool, but we don't know what tomorrow holds. We don't know what tomorrow may bring, but the signs point to that we can get through this. That despite things being ridiculous, the numbers being higher than we'd like them to be, we can still get through this. And so despite the concerns of voters, politicians, whatever, no matter what, the continued growth in our GDP, the investment in our bonds, and the management of how we mess with that ratio, the debt to GDP ratio, it all shows that our country is not too heavily reliant on this, that we can't get through this, that there's no other way. The United States is more than capable of managing its debt and controlling its economic future. Thank you.
Well, Todd, you're more optimistic than I am some days. And it is true, as Christians, we know that God's in control, but that's not going to change. So why don't we start here? Explain to us just what is a bond? When we talk about a bond, what is that effectively? What are people putting in us to buy those bonds?
Essentially, they see it's another form of debt financing. So like whenever we're in debt, we need to raise capital. Instead, we don't issue stocks as a government, so we issue bonds, which is essentially, okay, give me your money now, and then I'll give you more money down the line at a certain rate, at the interest rate of 5% or something like that. And so with that, what we're basically saying is, okay, invest in us and we will return to you back later. And like I was saying, is the joy of it is it's long term. Bonds aren't, okay, give me your money for 3 months and I'm gonna give it all back to you super quick. As our country, we have time to pay back these bonds. We've got 20, 30 years. And so, yes, as much as I don't like to put problems off till tomorrow, we are able to leverage and we're able to keep putting things off until we're able to pay for it. Because as the economist, as I was reading, I believe Cortez was the name, basically what that does is kind of puts it off to your kids, but the joy is too, and the hope is that your kids will be making more money than you are today. So whenever your kids are making more money, they'll be able to pay off those bonds better than maybe we are able today.
Good luck. It's trust, isn't it? I mean, if we don't trust that the government's going to pay us back, we're not going to buy those bonds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's what it really comes down to. Hallie, you have a question, comment?
I've learned so much about finance from your presentation. Honestly, I knew nothing about, I knew we have a very high national debt, but I don't know very much about finance. And so my question is kind of a hypothetical of this most likely will never happen, but what would happen to our economy if all of our debt just completely disappeared?
You're saying, so like, as if we paid all of it off, or like it all comes like crashing down on our stuff?
If we pay all of it off.
So we'd be in a really, really good spot. The odds of that happening are very low, but whenever we're able to get that number down, it helps a lot. The biggest thing is every country is going to have debt. We love leverage, we love it as our country, and so that's why we love credit cards so much. But essentially what it means is we're always going to have debt, and if we were to pay it all off, we'd be in a really good spot because we're continually doing business and we're continually making money. However, money goes in and money also goes out. As much as we are buying goods and spending money, money is also coming into us as well. And so there's kind of two schools of thought to that. But for the most part, it'd be a pretty good place to be if that never went down to zero.
What about the other option, if it all just crashed?
So essentially, that's where we get into the talk of psychology and how it applies to finance. We're not on the gold standard. Nothing really backs our money too much. It's belief and hope. And so countries look at us and they say, okay, I believe in the United States and I love what they're doing. And in fact, I think they're pretty good at what they're doing, so I'm going to invest more money into them. The event of a default, of like, hey, we can't pay back anybody that just gave us this, then that's when we're in a really bad state, and the whole world will be in a really bad state as well.
Give you an idea. If you buy a car, or you buy a boat, airplane, whatever, let's start with a car, and you can't pay for that car, what happens? They let you keep it? No. I'd use student loans. That's a bad example these days. But eventually the money comes due. What if you can't pay for that car? What do? They come take it back. If a country can't repay its debts, in extremis, in the worst case scenario, someone's going to come and try to get their money. Germany wanted to do that with Venezuela 100 years ago. They didn't. It's worth $1 because we all agreed to try to get their money. Either way, you're in trouble. It's worth $1 because we all agreed to try to get their money. Either way, you're in trouble. So, Eric, a question?
Great, Tom. I'm glad you're kicking us off this semester. I also do not know a whole lot about finance, but just
Spending more than we have, it's a dangerous spot. Payers, and we get to spend as much money as we like as a government. It's like, okay, we don't want to do that, and so we could do the flip side of it. But then the government doesn't have any money to work with. So there's a give and take to it, but essentially it's just like the way we vote is very important because of the officials that get elected. How they choose to view policies and how they enact their own policies is very important to us.
Anybody have a set of parents in here, one parent, uncle, somebody that cares about what money you spend? Anybody call you up? Anybody put a limit on how much you spend? Or can you spend whatever you like? Anybody ever tell you can't get a credit card? Shouldn't get a credit card? I've heard all those things. The government has no limit on its credit card unless we put one on its credit card. Because ultimately it does fall on y'all. We were under 100% GNP to debt until COVID actually. Stimulus spending tipped us over. But that's you have to make people accountable. Otherwise it's like you with an unlimited credit card. That doesn't work that way personally, but for a situation like a huge economy, we can get away with it for a while, but eventually a bill comes due. So you have to make people accountable. It's a good point. Vote. Go ahead.
I was gonna ask, with your point about how like Japan and China are investing, just kind of in America's economy as a whole, is there an advantage to that over bonds coming from our economy to our economy, like internally, versus those countries investing like from foreign countries?
Are you saying, I'm just making sure I understand it correctly, that we as individuals invest in our bonds instead of other countries invest in our
Yeah,
bonds?
like which one of those is there one that's more advantageous or?
Well, so there's pros and cons to it, because I was talking to one of my friends today, I'm like, well, I was like, yeah, we got everybody investing in us, Japan and China. He's like, yeah, well, we like Japan, but we may not like China as much. It's like, okay, well, that's a good point, is because there's, depending on political situations, it could get very complicated. But respectfully, I don't have like $1 billion or $1 trillion to go invest in bonds right now, so I don't know if I can buy out our country. And so I think that's where it gets challenging. But like just as much as other countries invest into us, we also invest into other countries.
And let's be sure about this. When we say we, sometimes it's individuals, sometimes it's governments, sometimes it's corporations, it depends. But again, I'll go back to the example of if you don't repay your debts, and it's another country that's put their money into you, they could come knocking. So that's typically been seen as more dangerous. Yeah, Allison?
Well, actually, it was kind of along the same train of thought that I was thinking on. So Japan and China both own a lot of bonds from the U.S. What other countries does the U.S. own bonds for? What do we believe in?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. There's other countries that we invest into. I did not gather as much data as I would like to have. As I was going through this, I was like, dude, I'd really like to know where we're putting our money now, as much as people are putting money into us. So that's something I don't know the answer to.
That's Mr. Dunsford again. Do you know?
Well, our foreign direct investments are going in other nations where we're investing in infrastructure, and we actually do invest in, like China and Japan and the company who you just mentioned. We've got a lot of places around the world where our foreign direct investments are going into establishing business, establishing rights to be able to have access to resources. It's proliferating our trade. So we have a host of nations that we do, but we actually do with exactly who's investing in us as well. But it's all around trade and around our access to resources, access to being able to generate our kickstart our GDP expansion.
It gets real tricky because we invest in each other's currencies too. If the United States has a strong currency, which we do, other countries are going to want to invest in American currency because it's a safety valve. If everything else goes wrong, the American dollar is probably worth something. If that changes, like we print or coin a lot more money than what we actually have gold and silver in the vaults, our money's not worth as much. Prices go up, wages go up to try to meet it, and that's what you call an inflationary cycle, which we're trying to come out of. But the way you crush it is to raise interest rates, trying to reduce the amount of money that's being spent on long-term loans because interest rates are high. Y'all haven't had to live through it. Interest rates went up to 7% or whatever they were for mortgages. Some of us in this room lived through an era where there were interest rates of over 20%. Imagine that. For every dollar you pay back, you got to pay back 20 cents on top of it, effectively. And that's how you crush a business cycle. And that was when Ronald Reagan was first president. And they killed inflation. But that's what happens when you crank out too much money than what you really have gold and silver to match it, to simplify it. That's what's going on. So, all right? Yes, ma'am. Kate?
I believe you implied that, so the healthy GDP for the EU would be 60%, and obviously the 123% isn't great. Is it just that it's below 100 is good, or is there like an ideal standard for the US? Because if it can't compare to the EU, then what would that be?
And that's what's difficult because of like, as you're looking at it, it's like, it's kind of a cop-out of me saying like, oh, actually, we'll never know if we're healthy or not. It's like, okay, that's not, we need to figure out when we're good and when we're not. And like we're saying, 124, 34, whatever we're at now, that's a big number. And that's a lot to deal with. And so whenever we're at this point, it's important for us to understand what we're dealing with. And honestly, in my mind, whenever I look at the EU, they're doing what they can, but not all other countries are like us. They're just not operating in a level of GDP, of trade, and things like that. They're just not doing what we're doing. And so, as a major economic power that we are, and as much trade as we have going in and out, I just don't think you're able to like say it's apples to apples, and that we're comparing two things that are the same.
Again, people make up countries, so what would it be like for you, again, if you're spending 123% of what you are making? It would never work. How much should you spend on a car, on a mortgage, on a student loan? What should you spend? Well, no more than what you know you can pay back. So you're forecasting to some degree, but nobody wants to spend 100% of their income just on one thing. Just paying the interest on our national debt is our largest item in our budget now because of how high the interest rates were. So it's a serious problem. So you'd have to gauge it, I think, country by country based on how much your income is. Over 100% is not healthy. It's not healthy in the short term or long term. So, all right, who's next? Go ahead.
You mentioned 3 different types of ways that the U.S. Treasury uses debt financing, bills, bonds, and notes, and you mostly seem to focus on bonds. So I apologize if you did talk about the other 2, but what are those ones compared to bonds?
So bills, I actually don't know. I didn't do a lot of good research in that. Notes are just shorter term bonds in the necessary sense of it. So like typically you're looking at about 2 to 10 years compared to 20 to 30. Bills, I'm not totally sure about. Mr. Dinsford, do you have anything on that for bills instead of bonds and notes?
No, I'll let you do the research.
I was trying to get some help. I didn't get any. But that, I'm not sure about that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sometimes they're used as synonyms, and they vary usually when people refer to them based on the length and the rate you get back. I mean, the longer you put your money out there, typically the better rate you're going to get back because you're allowing them to use your money for a longer period of time. The rates change every day based, again, on confidence and where the interest rates are overall. Did anybody peer through the bubble yesterday and see that the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates? You didn't even notice. You got a billion things going on, volleyball games and important things. But the interest rates came down. That'll affect bills and bonds. How else does a country make money? You could print it. That only goes on so long. That's inflation. How else? They can tax you. They can take your money. That's fun. Can you go to war and take somebody else's stuff? That's another way you can make money. Can you sell lands? We did that for a while when we had Western lands. What about if you discover gold? So get busy. Go find some gold and silver. Because that's the way a country can make money as well, if you tap into what metal reserves you have. But we rely on bonds quite a bit, and taxation. Tariff would be the other way, where you charge another country money, your corporation's money, to sell their stuff in this country. There's a 100% tariff on Chinese cars now. So Chinese electric cars, which keeps them out of the market. But that's how you make money as well. But they all have ramifications. You either have to pay the money back, somebody gets mad at you for putting an extra price on the stuff they're importing. There's always a consequence. It's never as simple as you make money. It's just not like that. All right, yes ma'am.
This is a great presentation. It's also something I don't know very much about, but it was good. And I guess you've kind of already implied this, but and kind of talked about it, but just in general, like, do you think it is possible at all for us to like change this for a future generation? Like, I don't know really any of it, but
I definitely didn't emphasize it enough. 100% debt to GDP ratio is not a good thing, and we definitely need to lower it. And I think it's definitely possible, but like we're saying, and I think the biggest word that I see whenever I'm through my research, it's dynamic. Everything's moving, everything's changing, and so whenever we start raising interest rates here, it's like, okay, whenever we raise interest rates on our bonds, it's like, okay, we're getting more money in now and we're getting more investors, but then we gotta pay that off later. And there's just so much give and take that we can see throughout the economy. It just depends. And like we're saying, we can go steal somebody else's stuff. We can steal money more from the taxpayer, but it depends on what we're trying to do there. And I think it's possible for us to lower it, but like we're saying too, the more we just keep printing money and keep having politicians that make policies that aren't protecting our economy, we're in a dangerous spot. But I think we can do it.
Anybody have a test this week? Why aren't you studying right now? Because you're gonna put it off till later. You're gonna study tomorrow? Nah, you put it off till the weekend. You convince yourself you're gonna do it Sunday afternoon. You know that's not true. You know you're gonna nap. Procrastination suits us all, doesn't it? And so I'll pay it, but I'll pay it tomorrow. And countries are the same way, if we're not careful. Well, I'll just pay it, I'll pay it later on. And so how do you stop debt? You either grow out of it, right? You make more money and grow your way out of it, or you stop spending, right? Or because taxation is only going to take you so far, right? And you don't want to go into further debt long-term by issuing more bonds. So suit yourself, but you're going to have to either grow your way out of it, like you. You have to make more money, but you'll probably spend more money. So you have to limit your spending. Countries are not a whole lot different. It's just they're not as accountable if we don't make them accountable. Fortunately here, you can vote another bunch of bums into office if you want, get the other bunch out. There's 435 of them. I mean, take your pick in your election. I suppose you're voting your district, but you can vote one person out, vote the other one in. Maybe they'll be more accountable. But if they know they're not accountable, it's like you with nobody watching your spending. So, yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
I'm not super familiar with finance either, so this is definitely super helpful presentation. I know for sure you mentioned this in your paper, you may have mentioned this in your talk too, about investors losing confidence in the system. And I know you talked a little bit about the psychology behind it as well. Is there like a point people have discovered that investors would just completely lose confidence, like take everything out, or like it just completely fails at all? Like is there a point we could reach where that would happen?
And that's kind of where not exactly what we saw in the Great Depression, where everybody just pulled their money out because, oh, there's no point in this. It's really that the banks weren't able to keep lending. It's just kind of part of the hope of it, I guess. There's a strong belief in our economy and a strong belief in our dollar. And so it's important for us to keep making good business decisions. But honestly, like, everybody's got such a large stake in it. It's really hard for someone to say, oh, I'm pulling my money out, and you pull your money out too, and we're all just gonna make our money right now and get a return. It's like, it's very dynamic, and so far we haven't really seen that. But as you can hear from a lot of investors, there's cycles to it. You'll see, as of right now, like we're looking at maybe a possible double down in the stock market. It's like, okay, there could be tremendous growth that may come after this, and it just depends. So there's different cycles you can look for, and some people like to do it, see if they can time it just right. But for the most part, people just keep believing in our dollar, and that's what upholds it the most. And of course, as we were talking about, the 80%, 85% of the gold that backs the dollar as well.
Carolyn, when are you going to loan somebody money? When they don't repay you? The minute they stop repaying you, you're going to stop loaning them money. If we ever stop repaying the bonds as they come due, when we stop repaying our debt as it comes due, people will stop buying our bonds. If they see the economy slow down to the point where we're not having that GDP or GNP growth, they're not going to buy our debt anymore. They're not going to loan us money. And that we includes us, because Americans buy bonds at a higher rate than foreign entities do. That's what it comes down to. So can you crash it? Yeah, you can crash it. You have to work real hard to crash a $28 trillion economy, but it can be done. Just keep spending with no restraint, right? So but you raise a good question. Is there an end to it? And of course, there's an end to it. So, but it takes some discipline and some restraint to bring it back under control. It's hard to stop spending. It's hard to ask people to sacrifice. It is. But that's probably going to be what it takes. So you either grow your way out of it, try to tax your way out of it, or a combination. So it won't be easy. It's probably going to be the financial story of the next 10 years of your lives. I wish I could give you a better scenario, but unless y'all write that $104,000 check, then we can get out of this. All right, how about questions from the audience? Anything? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Did you happen to see any research on the debt increases of the last couple presidential administrations? Like specifically how much the national debt was when the last couple presidents came into office, and then how much they left office with?
And I guess one thing we could do is look back at the national debt as it changes over time and compare it with where we're at. But it's like, as we can see within the past, especially since 2020, with our stimulus checks, and how that, it did stimulate our economy, it did help us get us back up, but it was a large amount of government spending. And no, I didn't have specific research as like, okay, who did what, where's this going? But we can say specifically at 2020, that's a big point where we have a lot of government spending and a lot of investment there.
Typically, when we go to war, we run up debt and we issue bonds every time. And you go into an inflationary spiral because you're printing more money than what you have in order to try to cover your bills. Inflation the last few years was bad, but try on 100% inflation. Try on 60 or 70% inflation, which is what it was in World War II. The Confederacy during the Civil War, they just print money. Their inflationary rate was 6,000% to 9,000% at times. You can't sustain an economy, and they didn't. They crashed. So we ran a surplus in the 1990s. That went away after 9/11, to your point, because we had to spend more on a war on terror. And that's where it's kind of gone off the rails. Yes.
Did you see in your research, I remember a few years ago seeing a news headline about how Chinese investors were purchasing land in Oklahoma, and people were very upset, like, well, now China owns part of America, like America's soil. In your research, did you see whether or not most of our foreign investment is through individuals or corporations or through the nations themselves? And if it is, like, what would be the consequences of it being a corporation versus a nation purchasing our debt?
I did not see anything about that. I've heard of, I wouldn't say rumors because it's real stuff that's happening, but it's difficult to say like what's more dangerous, because it's like, okay, what's more dangerous, someone owning a single family home in Oklahoma or someone owning $750 billion worth of our national debt? And so I think that's like what we see more of, from what I know of, is just countries investing in other countries. That's what we do to other people, and that's what other people do to us. Because the part of it is too, it's like, okay, we get one person to pay the $104,000 that needs to be paid from each taxpayer or each citizen. It's like, okay, cool. That only does a small percentage of it. Same way as if I just buy one bond or a certain amount, let's say my $1,000 worth in a bond. It's not as damaging or really as influential as it would be if we were to invest a larger sum of money. And so that's why we see more countries investing in other countries, because you can gain more money that way, but you can also gain more influence that way too.
It depends on how strictly the economy is controlled by the government. If you have more freedom of movement in the economy and more individual liberty, it's going to be individuals and corporations more. If it's more centralized, like China is effectively a fascist state with something of a modest market economy, but they're tightly controlled. It's going to be more the government controlling that and directing things. So it depends on the country. We're very used to individual investors. And that's not outside of the Western world as much. And so it depends. Yes, sir.
How much debt are we actually paying back per year, or how much debt we're actually gaining per year?
Great question. I also do not know the answer to that. The biggest thing is we look at the national debt and we're like, okay, we're paying some off, our GDP's here, and that's why the ratio is so good, is because we're like, okay, this is where we're changing. Let's say we gained a 5% increase in our GDP, or our debt to GDP ratio. It's like, okay, we're saying that our national debt is growing more than our GDP is. And so that's that's tough and difficult about it, is it's dynamic. Like we're saying, it's money moves, it doesn't really sit still, and it's always changing hands. And so that's what's difficult, is we can look back at the 90s and say, okay, there's our surplus right there, but then now we have a war that comes in and we wipe that out. And so it's difficult to say, but I'm sorry, I didn't have any research on that.
We're only paying the interest. And if we're only paying the interest, if we're barely making the interest payments, and we still have things we want to do, and promises we want to keep, your debt's going to go up. So you've got to cut spending. And with interest rates coming down, it's easier to, because the government pays that too, just like we do, interest rates. So when the interest rates come down, it's easier to service the debt. But that makes it easier to lay on debt itself. You say, well, we'll just add that much more because we're not paying as much interest. So to answer your question, we're not. And so you've got to get into the corpus of it, not just the interest, but the body of the debt. And again, that takes discipline. Not going to spend that money. You know, not going to do that. That's hard for anybody to do. Hard for a country to do.
And to add on to that some more, there's parts of it too that we didn't talk about that have been really cool too, is debt ceiling. Like we're talking about, countries can just spend as much as they like. We have a debt ceiling, but we change it, and we just vote it out. Well, okay, we're going to spend a little more now. And the other part of it too is debt refinancing too. It's like, okay, we loaned China $1,000 worth of bonds. Okay, we're going to now loan ourselves $1,200 now or whatever, and pay off their debt, but then we owe ourselves a debt, and it's very dynamic, like we're saying here. So it's difficult as to where the neutral ground really is whenever we do stuff like that and kind of manipulate the supply like that.
And the currency sometimes. Anything else? Yeah, as we sit here in this room, Congress is trying to figure out how they're going to spend money next year for us, the budget. And they will eventually raise probably the debt ceiling, and they'll come up with a deal, and they'll do it. But it's not going to be a balanced budget. There's no way. They would have to exercise a lot more restraint than what they have. So it's interesting what goes on as you attend school, and what's gone on for you guys is they've added to your burden, so watch what they're doing, make them accountable. That's the best way to handle it, I would suppose. And like you say, ultimately God's in control, and so you pray for better times. But then we're also supposed to be stewards, so take care of what's going on best you can. Any last things? Questions, comments? All right, thank you, Todd. Well, a less devastating thing economically is the matter of zebrafish. And so Hallie Martin's going to present to us on the nature of those laboratory specimens, how that helps us try to combat human disease. So,
Hey everyone, thank you for coming out tonight. As Dr. Spell mentioned, this is a much different topic than our national debt, but I hope you still find it interesting. I'll be talking about zebrafish research tonight and the connections it has to neuromuscular functions. So the zebrafish nervous system uses a collection of genes that are super similar to mammalian nervous systems, like us humans. This information, coupled with the ease of other experimental properties in zebrafish, such as their transparency in embryonic stages, so as they develop through that, you can see what's happening inside of them, and the fast generation of offspring, ex utero development, and simple manipulation of genes, it makes it a prime model for studying this neuromuscular function. And by studying the function, this research can be applied to examining human muscle disorders, or specifically with this model, Florida's prevalent red tide issue. So like these unique characteristics that I've mentioned make them an effective model also for studying human muscle disorders. They exhibit motor behaviors that are easily reproducible within experiments and quantifiable. Like I mentioned before, the zebrafish embryos are transparent throughout their development, so we can see their structural growth as they grow, and specifically their skeletal muscle. It's their largest organ structure during development, and it closely resembles the human muscle at an ultrastructural level. There are 3 muscle structures that are crucial to comprehending the development of human muscle disease. I'm not going to really go into them much. I'm just going to give you some kind of big words. The structures are the dystrophin-associated glycoprotein complex, the excitation-contraction coupling machinery, and the contractile apparatus. So we don't have to worry about those too much tonight, but I am going to give you 3 key structures that are the main techniques for creating these zebrafish models of muscle disease. So we have to go in to the zebrafish and change them a little bit so that we can study these specific diseases. So this gene change, it's just going to change them to kind of more alike how they present in our bodies. The first one is morpholino-based gene knockdown. It's a fast but temporary method. It's where it goes in and targets a very specific gene, and then it blocks translation to make it stop working so that we can just change it like I mentioned. And then genetic screens identify germline mutations based on their muscle function. So germline, it's just focusing on offspring. And then the next one is genome editing techniques, and it's going to allow for precise mutations in specific genes. I know that many of you have had bio classes talk about this before, gene editing. These methods do have some limitations, but they have proven successful in many models of muscle diseases, and future research will include these methods, but as always, we're looking for new methods every day, and discovery is being established and explored. But like humans, zebrafish muscles are controlled by special neurons in the nervous system called motor neurons. Zebrafish spinal motor neurons are classified into primary and secondary groups based on their development and the muscles that they innervate, the nerve pattern within them. Our primary group is going to be the larger of the two, and it's going to appear on the axon, the nerve axon, during the first stages of nerve development. Every spinal segment contains 3 to 4 identifiable primary neurons, which are distinguished by location, axonal paths, and electrical properties. Our second group are secondary neurons. They're smaller yet more numerous, and they develop later than the primary neurons, usually with finer axons because they're going to reach longer distances in the system. The secondary neurons have been further categorized, so it's kind of like we have our 2 big groups, and then our secondary neurons come down into 2 smaller groups based on their muscle innervation patterns. So the dorsoventrally projecting secondary neurons are located at the top. They innervate both the dorsal and ventricle muscles, which is the back and the front. So the dorsal is the back, ventral is the front, while the ventrally projecting have a more restricted ventral innervation area, which is only focused on the front. These secondary neurons branch extensively in the muscle, suggesting that they activate fast twitch muscles. And the dorsally projecting neurons, which are found below the VS, which are the ventral innervation area neurons, they primarily innervate the dorsal muscles and branch widely in fast skeletal muscles, which means they have thinner axons, like I mentioned before. So because they're thinner, they go further as opposed to our primary neurons. And then there were also 2 other classes of secondary neurons identified, which were characterized by a major collateral axon along, kind of like between 2 muscles. And then classifying them by their electrical properties, they fall into 2 subtypes, the chattering class and the bursting class. They're both pretty similar. The chattering class has a lower signal threshold, and it shows significant frequency adaptation during prolonged stimulation. The bursting class, very similar, basically produces slower membrane potential changes, but there's not a direct match between them. However, the neurons tend to be more located ventrally than the bursting ones, more ventrally than the chattering. Essentially, the bursting neurons are usually going out in just one energy change, while the chattering will often send more than one rapid fire burst, but they can both do rapid fire of action potential. But the primary neurons are going to oversee the initiation of swimming. These are not the thicker ones, but as opposed to the secondary ones, they're thinner. So the secondary neurons will just be more active during slow endurance swimming. So the primary initiation and fast swimming, if the fish is in danger and needs to get away quickly, it'll initiate those primary neurons as opposed to secondary neurons. And so since the neuromuscular research on campus is focused more on rapid movement, we'll be looking at primary neurons mostly. So that kind of takes me into what we're doing here on campus. My last talk was over the neurocognitive functions and the tests that we've been doing up in the lab at the Ed building, which is also Dr. Stafford's office. So that's kind of our workspace up there. But we're performing neuromuscular and neurocognitive tests on adult zebrafish to elucidate effects of red tide toxicity on these 2 different nervous system functions. The first test I'm going to tell you about is the spinning task test. This is a test that we performed in the lab mostly last semester. This semester we're really focusing on neurocognitive effects. But the spinning task test is a neuromuscular test that is commonly used in toxicology studies to test muscular endurance. So essentially we're going to be creating a whirlpool that we'll put our fish into, and we're going to time them and we use EthoVision software to track their movement. It's like a camera that connects to our computer so we can follow them. We're just going to time them, see how long it takes before the fish is pulled into the force of the whirlpool to the base of our beaker. After that, we'll take it out and it will be put into a solution with brevetoxin. So the brevetoxin is the toxin that's in red tide. So after they get put into brevetoxin, they're allowed to sit in that and let it kind of like inhibit their nervous system, and then they'll be put back into our whirlpool and see how long it takes for them to be overtaken by the current after being intoxicated with the toxin. So we can see how it's affecting their muscular function. And then after our trials, we'll be using acetylcholine testing through blood draws. And this will determine if there's a correlation between the brevetoxin exposure and acetylcholine levels. So if you have a low acetylcholine level, they're associated with muscle disorders and can cause issues with muscle contraction. So that's going to directly tell us how the brevetoxin affected the fish. And then the one that we've been mostly working on this semester, myself and Meredith have been working on neurocognitive tests. So essentially we'll just be doing a novel object recognition test. We start with our initial objects were little yellow blocks. We put them into a tank, and we have them sat outside, kind of like their homing tanks, so that each day goes by, they can see them and they get familiar with them. They know that they're not a threat. So when they're put into the experimental tank, they see two of those similar objects, and they're allowed to swim around. We track them with our EcoVision software, and we can see how they react to them, and then they're taken out. And we replace one of the familiar objects with a novel object. So it's just in the past been like a multicolored taller block of the same type. And then we put them back into the experimental tank, track them again, see how they react. Each time is going to be 5 minutes. This is kind of our total control trials, is the familiar and then the novel. So that just establishes our data so that when we get the brevetoxin in their system, we can redo the same tests, put them in with the familiar objects, and then put them in again with the novel objects and see how it changes. So we've seen our EcoVision software creates heat maps for us, so it's a lot easier for us to tell than just watching them. We can see the areas they frequent the most within the tank and the areas they frequent the least. And it's very obvious when looking at a picture that they do not like going near the objects, first of all, but they really do not like the novel object. You can see mostly in the corners, they love the corners. It gets red in the corners, they'll sit in the corners, but they will not come close to objects. If it's a familiar object, they have been known to like swim up and get real close to it, and just like they're kind of like, oh, this is fine over here, but through our data, we have not seen any of our fish come even close to our novel objects. So we can see from that that something is affecting them. And so the brevetoxin, essentially, we are going to see if when we give them the brevetoxin, if it affects their function and they do go up to that novel object, then we know that something was wrong and we have to find a way to fix that. But our first trial is just seeing the brevetoxin affects their cognition. But these zebrafish serve as a valuable model for understanding neuromuscular function and studying human muscle diseases. They have unique advantages, like I mentioned before. They're transparent embryos, and their development, easily observable motor behaviors, like in our tests, and they allow researchers to investigate the intricate neurology of muscle function. The similarities between zebrafish and human muscle at both molecular and structural levels enhance the relevance of findings from zebrafish studies to human conditions. So studying these zebrafish is helping us in return, it's helping them, it's helping our oceans. But the distinct classes of motor neurons in zebrafish provide insights into the complexities of neuromuscular interactions and disease progression. But overall, zebrafish represent an essential part of the ongoing efforts of research, paving the way for an improved understanding of human neuromuscular health. Thank you.
And they also multiply rapidly, right? So you have a lot of zebrafish, different than some of those other things. Talk about, just for a second, because I know you mentioned this, and it was a point that was interesting in that article too. The knockdown or knockout therapy, that has to do with DNA manipulation. You're not doing any of that here,
No.
of course, right? But that has to do with how to manipulate them so you can see if you can improve muscle function, correct?
So it's just essentially changing their genes to make it look more like how our genes look in our bodies, so that when we give them a toxin or study any kind of toxicology study with them, we can see how it affects them, and we can come up with solutions to fix how it affects us.
So it gives you a baseline. Okay, Tom?
Is there anything, excellent presentation by the way, is there anything that y'all had seen that maybe like ecologists have already seen when it comes to maybe zebrafish patterns like already in the ocean when it comes to red tide? Do they seem that fish don't want to get near it at all? Are they running away from it? Is it affecting like their swimming patterns?
I'm not sure. I'm gonna assume that when the red tide is in the water, that the fish aren't really aware of what's happening to them. So they'll swim into it and not know what they're ingesting because they're just fish. They're not gonna have that ability to understand. They can understand dangers like, oh no, shark's coming at me, better run away. But, and then they'll have stuff happen in their body and they die. So it'll just kill them. We've had tests happen, I never did this, but we've had tests happen where we weren't sure exactly how much brevetoxin to give our fish, and so kind of overdosed them and it just didn't get death. So, yeah, I don't think that they'd really be aware of it, I'm not really sure.
And by doing that, we test human endurance to it, or how to combat it, or what are we doing there?
Essentially, we're just trying to figure out how it affects them first, so we can see what kind of remedy we need to study to change the waters.
Because they mimic us to some degree. Ms. Morris?
This is a very good presentation. I don't know if this is necessarily relevant to this topic, but I know that it said that it was a lot about zebrafish have the motor neurons, and like you were saying that they have display some of the things we display. So I was just wondering if diseases like, I know ALS is related to like motor neurons, is stuff like that something we can research with zebrafish, or is that completely unrelated?
Honestly, from what I've read, the way that we manipulate their genes, I'm not sure if it could be specifically ALS, but from the methods we have to manipulate their genes, if we can change their genes from our methods to make it look like ours and give kind of the same circumstances for that to happen in them, I'm assuming that we can do that. I haven't read any studies about zebrafish and ALS, but that would be very interesting.
What other muscular diseases are they looking at then, with them?
Honestly, most of my research was just a connection between neurology and muscle function, so.
So you just stuck with that,
Mm-hmm.
the direct tie there. Sarah?
I was just wondering specifically, you talked about the neuromuscular and neurocognitive tests that you've already done on the zebrafish. I was just wondering if there's any tests that y'all are planning on doing, like that you think will be beneficial for getting more information, or any like future ones you think that would be beneficial for, I don't know, just finding out new things.
Mm-hmm. There is another neuromuscular test that we have not performed yet. It's called a startle response test. And so essentially, zebrafish gets put in the tank and then we cause something to happen in the water. So we drop something in the water or touch the water and see how it reacts to it, and then intoxicate it, do the same thing and see if its response time is lower. So that's just another test that we might be doing in the future. But
Riley?
So it definitely, research is like a long process, and it seems like you guys have been working right now on the control side of things. How much longer do you expect, or like how many trials do you want to run to get a good sample size before you do more of the brevetoxin trials, that kind of thing?
So right now in the lab we have 4 tanks, like homing tanks. 2 are male and 2 are female. And each tank has about 6 fish. We're working on finding a new novel object to use for our trials because our last ones just, they weren't working that great, and so we're getting some new ones. We're gonna separate the fish into cohorts and do each cohort with a different colored novel object, and we're gonna see also if the color affects how they react to the object. So we'll do those 4 tanks with about 5 to 6 fish in each, and then we're hoping to have our findings published by the end of this semester. So we'll be starting after we get our control trials done in the next couple weeks. So we'll be starting brevetoxin trials.
Where do you hope to have it published?
Anywhere. I know our last study was just kind of published on like PubMed kind of places, but just like a scientific publication.
Yeah, those are the kinds of publications that tell us what we don't know, right? But that's where you go through, that's the process, so, very good. All right, Kate?
This has kind of already been mentioned a little bit, but so you perform both neuromuscular and neurocognitive tests. Does one or the other kind of provide more long-lasting effects on them afterwards? Like detrimental effects, I guess, is what I'm asking.
I'm not sure. I don't think the tests would really like give any effects to them. It's more of like the toxin doing the affecting, and I mean, honestly, that spinning test I mentioned, the fish might be a little bit dizzy afterwards, so I'm gonna say that one would probably give the most effect on the zebrafish. But usually, after intoxicating them, they should return back to a normal level because we won't be giving them that much unless an overdose happens and they die.
Allison?
So I was wondering, in the article before, it mentioned that one of the benefits for using zebrafish is that they multiply rapidly. And so do you use the offspring of the zebrafish that you have in the lab for further experiment, even after they've been exposed to rebotoxin?
We have worked last semester, we had a student working in the lab on like embryos and breeding, and we had a little bit of luck with that. Honestly, it was happening with a student before, so there's been multiple students coming through trying to work on reproduction of them. Honestly, we haven't been able to get it down yet, so we do just get new fish in and we need more fish, but that would be very interesting to see how the offspring of fish have been affected after a fish comes into contact with the rebotoxin, but I'm not sure.
Kind of goes along with Kate's question, how far do you poison them right before? I mean, again, this is Frankenstein's lab or something. So, yeah, that's a good question. And it's going to keep on going. It's only, what, the second or third year Dr. Stafford's been pursuing, is that right?
That's right.
Yeah, okay. All right, Meredith?
Well, great job. It's fun to hear about it from the outside. So with the rebotoxin, what you're talking about with the neurocognitive tests and especially with the acetylcholine tests, that is more from a chemical level, if I understand that correctly. So that's kind of happening directly on that one fish that we're testing. But with the neuromuscular stuff, would that be more we're tracking the next generation? Like how, like is that a gene mutation thing? Or is that going to happen also on within that generation that we're testing? Does that question make sense?
Like, is that kind of connected to the question about embryos having issues after being intoxicated?
Yeah, kind of. Just, I guess my main question is just, if a fish shows muscular, like structural muscular defects after the rebotoxin, is that going to be present in the first generation, or is that going to be an offspring?
I don't know. I'm not really sure. I think maybe once we get our reproduction down, our breeding down, that maybe we can find that out, but I'm not sure. It's a good question.
All right, Eric?
So is the purpose of this experiment more to see its effect on marine life, or to see how it could affect a human if they were to ingest rebotoxin?
So the first part of this is essentially because we're using fish because, well, one, we can't test on humans, and the fish they do live in the red tide all the time, and so we are testing to help this marine environment, but also to use that research to find a way to help us. So it's kind of a little bit of both.
You're thinking about taking some of those politicians that spend too much money, aren't you? Put them in that spinning test or something. Yeah. And the idea of a neuromuscular response there, that's what goes to being exposed to the toxin, how they respond. Is there any solution for that, right? That's kind of where we're going. Because red tide, you grew up around here, affects the economy. Red tide affects health dramatically, especially someone who has asthma. Anybody ever been around red tide? And it'll just shut somebody down. It's hard to breathe if you're around a real big bloom of red tide. So it affects the state's economy at times. And it's not completely predictable. So do you have anything else, Eric?
So if you're focusing on, it says rapid swimming to see its effect on that, how would that translate to human? Like, what about us would it affect?
Well, essentially, we are using rapid swim tests, just to see how it affects their neuromuscular function. And so that's just one of the ways that we've chosen to kind of look into them and get a real look at what's happening in their bodies. I'm sure you could do tests where you use those slower twitch muscles, like the secondary motor neurons, but we've just chosen to stick with the rapid tests.
Meredith, anything else? No? Kate, anything else? Don't care any more about the zebrafish? I'll let it go. Okay. Anything else, Riley? Nothing? Todd?
Thank you for your presentation. It helped make neuroscience a lot more simple and easy to understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know. She used some terms that I was wondering what in the world she meant. So, yes. Questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
What are a few related aspects when using the zebrafish to like explore muscular development?
Honestly, in all of my research, I read a lot of papers about zebrafish in research, and not many of them give negative effects to it. I would assume if we're going to translate zebrafish research to human research, it's not, obviously we're not the same as zebrafish, so it won't match exactly, but with the gene mutations that we can do, it gives us a pretty good look into how it's going to affect us.
Are you wondering about the ethics of this?
No, not
Okay.
the ethics. Just like you said, like kind of how it translates over to
Oh,
if it's super equal or if it's like I gotta look at this more to try and make it work for us.
right. I think their conclusion is that it does replicate some of what we have in terms of muscle structure. The advantage is you can't see through them. And so you can see what the results are as they're exposed to different things. See what the muscle responses are, the twitch and whatnot, like you're saying, what the connection is between, what their little brains are thinking and what their bodies are doing. That's the advantage. Because there is an ethical question. And zebrafish those are supposed to get around or at least solve some of the ethical questions of using live animals for research in labs. So, anything else? Questions, Todd?
Are you all using fish that have a gene knocked out or knocked down, or just good old full
Just
normal,
adult
normal
zebrafish,
zebrafish?
normal
Okay.
adult zebrafish. Mhm.
Yeah, we don't have the equipment for, I think so.
Sometimes you can buy those.
Yeah.
If some lab has created one, you can,
Yeah.
ask for those.
Genetically modified
Yes.
zebrafish. Yeah.
Pretty common, actually.
Yeah.
There's an economy for that.
There you go, we got business opportunity.
Sorry.
Anything else from the group? All right, well, thank you very much, Ally. Well, appreciate you all being here. There's a lot going on, and people have to leave and go do different things. That's why we got a little bit of a break between presentations. But it's a busy time. There's always something going on any given night of the week, and exams are coming up. Don't delay to study, right? Don't be like that. Our next honors evening is October the 8th. We'll have 3 presentations that night, and there'll be a little introduction that goes out for it to the campus before that evening as we did today. So again, Hallie, thank you very much. Todd, thank you for our panel. Appreciate your work very much, and wish you all a good night.